This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is what I use to publish my own photography website, not because they sponsored this video or other videos on my channel for that matter, but because I truly believe that it is the best tool for the job, because you don't need to have any web design experience or coding experience to know anything about this stuff. You just go to Squarespace, you sign up for a new account, you pick whichever template you like, you upload your images, you sort and categorize them however you want, and you're able to build a website by yourself on your own without needing to hire a designer, a developer, or anything like that. You can register a domain, you can start an email newsletter list, you can even sell digital goods and products, downloads, courses, all that good stuff by adding e-commerce functionality onto your website. Whatever type of website you need, you can start building it today by heading over to squarespace.com/Dominey and sign up for a free 30-day trial. And then when you're ready to go live, use my last name, Dominey, to save 10% off a new website or domain. You know, for me, making prints of my photography is one of the most exciting and rewarding aspects of the entire image creation process. It's the moment in which a photograph that I've been, staring at sometimes for a long time over there on screen comes to life in the real world as a physical, tangible, real thing. But on the flip side of the coin, printing can also be frustrating and challenging and sometimes disappointing too, right? If that sounds familiar to you, well, hopefully something in this video will help you out. All right, step one is honestly, one of the most important steps of all, and that is to make sure that your screen is properly calibrated. I mean, think about it like a musical instrument, right? I mean, when a musical instrument's out of tune, it doesn't matter how many years of experience you have, how good you are, how talented you are. If the instrument is out of tune, well, all of the notes and chords you play are going to be off. And calibration is especially important when making prints, because calibration is not simply fixing the colors and making the colors more accurate. It's also about tweaking the brightness and luminance of your display to better match the luminance and the reflectivity of paper. And what can oftentimes happen with a screen that has not been properly calibrated, if you just, unpacked a monitor, put it on your desk and plugged it in, started using it, odds are your display is too bright. The brighter your display is, the more bias there is, the more influence there is, and you're going to be influenced into pushing your brightness levels down. You're going to be lowering the exposure of your images to make them darker, to make them dimmer, to counteract the brightness of the display. And that can give you a false sense of security, with how much detail and texture you're seeing in your blacks and your shadows, and then you make a print and it all just kind of comes out looking like mud. Okay, step two. The next thing that I recommend doing, if you're not doing this already, is to make some test prints. Do I have enough contrast in the image? Are my colors saturated enough? Are they vibrant enough? Is my image too dark? Is it too muddy looking? Sometimes just seeing an image on paper as opposed to seeing it on screen is enough to kind of decide, do I really want to make a print, of this image? I know that may sound a little bit weird, but sometimes you get an image on paper and you kind of eyeball and it's like, I don't know if this is necessarily a good print, because not all good images make good prints. Place where I use to make my larger prints that are, bigger than my printer can do, I use Whitewall for that. I've always used them. I really like the results that I get from them. And by the way, they're not paying me to say any of that. They're not sponsoring this video. They don't know anything about this video. You can order high quality test prints through them. Like, you can choose the specific paper you want to print on at the actual size that you want, and they will slash the cost of the print and send you a test print that has, like watermarks all over it, like this one does here. Okay, so when preparing a PSD like this for print, what I like to do first is come up here to the image menu, go to duplicate, check the merge option here. And actually, I'm going to change the name while I'm in here. I'm going to add print to the end of it. Click OK. And then now we have a new flattened version of the image. I then come up here to edit, go to convert to profile, and then I make sure that Adobe RGB is selected here. And I typically like to use relative color metric. You can also choose perceptual. Make sure that black point compensation is checked and then hit OK. There could be some color shifting going on, but odds are, the image is probably going to look exactly the same. Now, the reason I changed to Adobe RGB is because labs like Whitewall and other ones, they typically only accept images in the color spaces of sRGB or Adobe RGB. And Adobe RGB is a larger color space compared to sRGB. All right, so the next thing I typically do when I'm preparing an image for print is soft proof the image. Now, soft proofing is a feature of Photoshop. It's also built into other applications as well. This is a feature that you can use in order to create a preview on screen of what your image is going to look like when printed. And soft proofing can be incredibly helpful. I mean, we can use it to diagnose problems with the image, get a feeling for how it's going to look, and all that's good. But it can also be very misleading as well, which I'll demonstrate for you in just a minute. But the first step is to come up here and enable soft proofing. We go to View, Proof Setup, and then you select Custom. Now, let's just take a look at what's going on here for a minute. If I, check and uncheck the preview box here, enable it and disable it, take a look at what's happening with the image. It changes quite a lot, doesn't it? I mean, there's a pretty notable change in the overall brightness of the image. There's a difference in the contrast of the image, the color temperature. It's just a very different looking image. And again, this is because paper and ink is just a very different medium than the screen that you're looking at. It can't reproduce the same tonal range that you see on screen. Like on screen, we have the luxury of, black is at 0, white's at 255. We're able to see all the shades of gray in between, but paper is more compressed. Paper is more like on average between 10 and like 240, like roughly, somewhere around there. And those values can be, a little bit wider than that or a little more narrow, depending on the type of paper you're printing on. Typically glossier papers, metallic papers, highly reflective papers, those goalposts can be a little bit wider. Whitewall actually has something they call Ultra HD paper. I've never used it before, but this is part of the reason why they create papers like that, in order to better emulate the tonal range that you're able to see on screen. And it's not quite as soft, in other words. But on average, photo paper is always a little bit softer and less contrasty than what it is that you see on screen. So that's why, the preview that you're looking at here is different. And there's other characteristics at play as well, which we'll get into here. The other thing I want to quickly point out to you, let me just bring the histogram over here so we're able to see this. Notice what happens when I enable and disable the preview. Take a look at the histogram. Notice anything different? Well, you're not supposed to. There is nothing different. The histogram does not change at all. Soft proofing is just, it's like an overlay. It's just something that sits on top of your image on screen. It doesn't affect the pixels in your image. It doesn't alter the image at all. Okay, in this window here, what I do is first select the ICC profile for the paper I will be printing on. And because I'm printing this image at Whitewall, I'm using one of their ICC profiles. So when you were printing through Whitewall or other labs, you download ICC profiles from them for the papers that they provide, for the papers that they support and that they print on. Or if you have your own printer at home and you're buying your own paper, you would download ICC profiles from the paper manufacturer. Okay, so again, I am printing on Fuji Crystal Archive paper from Whitewall, so I am soft proofing against that. Then we can leave preserve RGB numbers unchecked. No need to enable that. Rendering intent, Whitewall recommends relative color metric, so I am going with that. Okay, then we have black point compensation here. This is the kind of thing where, if you're not an expert at this kind of stuff, you definitely want to leave this enabled. Wherever you see it, like when you're making a print, just enable black point compensation. It's an important setting, and what the proof is emulating here is the effect that black point compensation is going to have when the image is actually printed. And when the software prints it and you have that option in there, like I print on a Canon printer, and there's an option in there for black point compensation. So when you check that, the software is going to automatically lift the darkest pixel in your image. What is black in your image? It's going to lift that to the darkest black that can be supported on the paper type you are printing on. And then all the darker shades just a little bit higher than that, they will also be lifted up in relation to that darkest black so that the roll off looks natural and it looks normal. So this is a good thing to enable, and when Whitewall actually prints this and makes a print from it, they will be using black point compensation. So it's good to proof the image with that enabled. Okay, then we get into this area down here where we have simulate paper color. And if we disable it, we have the option of just enabling simulate black ink. If you simulate paper color, it's going to automatically include the black ink option, but we can also just target black ink if we want to. So let's begin here. So simulate black ink, what this is doing is simulating how the darkest tones in your image, how black and all of the darkest shadows will appear perceptually. Like when you make a print, you print it out, you put it under, proper lighting or put it on the wall or whatever. When you're looking at it, this is how dark the blacks and the dark shadows in your image are going to appear to the average viewer. It's going to simulate the luminance of those darkest tones in your print. So it's kind of similar to black point compensation, but black point compensation is lifting the tones in your image to fit the gamut of your paper, while simulate black ink is more perceptual. It's more simulating how it's actually going to appear when you view the print. And this is helpful information to know because we can gauge, how dark the blacks are, how dark the shadows are going to be, and whether we need to make any adjustments to account for that, to account for how it's going to look. Okay, then back to simulate paper color. Now, simulate paper color is probably the most misleading part of soft proofing. And the reason why it's misleading is because my display, your display, I don't have a phone here in front of me, but your phone, your tablet, your laptop, even your television, all the screens that we have, they all use a white point of D65, which is equivalent to 6,500 Kelvin. The printing world, however, uses a different white point. The printing world uses D50. D50 is equivalent to 5,000 Kelvin. There's obviously a little bit of a difference there, right? And we can see here that when I check this box on and off, the image appears to get cooler. It seems to get more blue, right? My instinct here is to throw like a selective color adjustment layer on here, select neutrals, and go in and start messing around with my neutrals in order to offset that change, in order to make the image warmer, because the paper is forcing the image to be cooler. But this is the confusing thing about simulate paper color, because simulate paper color is assuming a D50 white point. And because D65 is inherently cooler in general than D50, well, when you simulate paper color, the ICC profile is making the image even bluer, even colder than it will be when the image is printed. Like for example, like this test print right here. I mean, this is one that I printed on my Canon printer over there, compared it to what I see on screen using both D50 and D65. And no question, the print is definitely closer to D50 than it is to the D65 mode on my screen. So what do we do about this, right? I mean, how do we work around this? Well, there are two things you can do. And the first and the easiest is just to disable simulate paper color. Like, don't even use it. Instead, just check simulate black ink and proof against that, because then you're able to, just focus on the tonality of your image. Just focus on how bright or how dark it is, how contrasty it is. Don't worry about color temperature, and don't be misled by simulate paper color, because that could lead to problems, especially if you go in there and start cranking up the color temperature of your image, trying to compensate for what it is that you're seeing when using that mode. The easiest thing to do is just to disable it. The other thing you can do, if this is something that you're passionate about, that you really want to get into, and you want to be more exact, you want a more exact proof on screen compared to what it is that you're seeing on paper. Well, to do that, you need to calibrate your display to the D50 white point. Don't use D65 when you're soft proofing. Use D50 instead. And that's, really simple and straightforward to do. When you have a calibrator like this one, like I talked about the importance of calibration earlier, this is one of the reasons, because when you calibrate, you can choose the white point, and you can do either D65 or D50, and the software will take care of all of that for you. This is also one of the reasons why I use a BenQ display that has multiple color modes in it. color modes that I can quickly and easily switch between using this puck that sits on my desktop here. Because for example, what I've done here is I have number 1 on my puck calibrated for Adobe RGB D65, which is for editing images on screen, general use, editing video, all that kind of stuff. It is the mode that I use like 99% of the time. But when I am soft proofing, when I am preparing an image to make a print, I use the number 2 color mode. And this one is calibrated for Adobe RGB D50, exactly. And then I can check that box, simulate paper color, and the results are more accurate and more true. All right, so back to the image here. Now that I have soft proofing enabled and I'm viewing an emulation of what my image is going to look like on screen, the next thing I do is come in here and make any necessary adjustments that I feel need to be made in order to get an image that looks a little bit closer to the original, to the one that I edited for screen. And typically what I do is just try to lift the darker tones in the image and just bring everything up a little bit, because paper is just inherently dimmer than what you see on screen. Even if you reduce the brightness of your display all the way down and to a low level to match the the luminance of paper, like I've done here, but it's still just feels like inherently a little bit dimmer. So typically what I do is throw a levels adjustment here on top, and then I just push the midpoint a little further towards black, like not a whole lot, just a little bit. It's shifting the tonal balance of the image. It's pushing more of the dark tones further up the brightness scale, and just lifting everything up just a little bit more in order to bring more light into some of these darker areas. Now, when you do this, you could lose a little bit of contrast. So after making this adjustment, the next thing I typically do is throw a curves adjustment layer on top, and then I start adjusting the tonal values a little bit. I bring the blacks back down a little bit and just inject a little more contrast back into the image, back into especially concentrating on the midtones, because more of the tonal values, not only from the change I just made, but also just because of the more limited tonal range of the paper that I'm printing on, more of the tonal values have been pushed towards the middle, and it's lacking a little bit of that punch that we had before. So just a little bit of a contrast adjustment is usually a good thing. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, we can keep an eye on our color by coming up here, go to View, and select Gamut Warning. Now, Gamut Warning is going to warn us if there are any colors out of gamut, if there's any colors in the image that cannot be printed by the printer. And because this is a rather subdued, low saturation image, I'm not seeing any problems, but let me just show you what'll happen or what you can expect to see if there are saturation issues. So let's just crank up the saturation here. Anywhere you see that gray, that means that there's a color there or a range of colors that cannot be replicated on paper, and you need to make some kind of adjustment to them in order for them to be in gamut. And that's typically something that happens with more highly saturated images. So you can either reduce the global saturation of your image just to bring everything down a little bit, or you can be more targeted in your adjustment with this HSL panel here. Another option you have for adding contrast, for those of you who want to get a little more fancy, is to be more selective by using a luminosity mask. Now, I'm using the TK9 plugin here from Tony Kuiper. This is something I've mentioned in a bunch of my videos. But typically what I'll do if I want to increase midtone contrast is just click the middle contrast option here, create a curve, and that's going to throw that up there on top with a mask that is just targeting my midtones, and then come up here and choose soft light. And this targets more contrast towards those midtones, and it tapers off towards the darkest areas of the image. Okay, so then when I'm feeling better about the contrast and the luminance and the brightness in relation to the original image that I edited for screen, I then save this second document as its own PSD, so I can keep those adjustment layers, any and all adjustment layers that I added to the layers panel over there to account for the paper that I'm going to be printing on. I save this as its own PSD, and then from here I create a third document. And we do that again by coming up here to Image, Duplicate, going to merge everything again. And let's just go ahead and put change the file name of it here. And I'm going to change this to 18 by 24 because that, or rather those are the dimensions I will be printing to. So I'm going to click OK. So now I have a flattened version of the PSD with my print adjustments in it. And this is the image that I can now use for resizing, sharpening, denoising, all that good stuff. Now, if you're just downscaling the image, if you're just making a smaller image, like you can see that, at its native resolution, this is a very high resolution image captured using a Fuji 102 megapixel camera. So it is 38 inches wide on its longest edge at 300 DPI. But if I were, say, doing something like, 24 inches wide, 18 by 24 is a standard 4 by 3. Now I have a 24 by 18 image that I can begin working with. If you're upscaling, you can, just do, the same thing here in Photoshop if you want to, like 48 by 36, something like that. But in my experience, I've always received the best results when upscaling when using Gigapixel AI from Topaz Labs. That's what I use. Okay, so what I typically do next is, just like come in here and take a look at the image. And now that it's been resized and I have actual pixels to be working with here, I can make a decision about, what I want to do with things like noise and sharpness and details and all of that. What exactly do I want to do with this when making a print? And the thing to remember when making a print is that some amount of texture, some amount of sharpening is always lost. It's ink on paper, and when ink hits paper, it disperses, it spreads. Glossy papers, metallic papers, they do an excellent job with details and textures, but the more soft the paper gets, the more matte it gets, it tends to lose more detail. It tends to lose more of those finer details. Okay, so the first step is duplicating our base layer here. So I'm going to duplicate it, create a new one, and then come up here to Filter, go to Other, and then choose High Pass. High Pass is going to look for areas of division in the image, like where one area of like one tonal value or color transitions into another. And this is too much. Like a little goes a long way with high pass. I typically bring it down to, to somewhere like around here to where it's a little bit softer, but still able to see some of these fine details. So I'm gonna hit OK, and then change the layer blend mode of this high pass layer to overlay. That's without high pass, and that's with high pass on. It's not only, improving the texture and detail, but it's also helping improve some of the mid-tone contrast, some of the micro contrast that is, in these areas of the image. If you feel like it needs a little bit more, you can flatten this and then create another duplicate layer. And then you can choose either Smart Sharpen. Smart Sharpen is good because with this you have more controls if you want that. You can also save presets in here. You can see that I have 3 presets here for print sharpening, at different, with different values for radius and amount. You can also do it the old school way. You can come up here, go to Filter, and then do Unsharp Mask. And Unsharp Mask works, really quite well. You might want to go a little bit heavier, pop out those textures and those details. That's with additional sharpening. That's without. That's on. That's without. This could be a little much for viewing on screen, but on paper, it should look as expected. Something I recommend doing just as a gut check, just to make sure that everything is good, is to, zoom into the image. And if you've been applying sharpening to it, look for any white halos. Like look for any haloing, look for anything that looks obvious, makes it obvious that the image was sharpened and sharpened quite a lot. Like you just want to, keep an eye on that, because if you see white halos here, there's a chance that when you make your print, you're going to see halos there as well. And that's not what you want. You want to keep it as clean and as natural looking as possible. So after sharpening, I then flatten all the layers in the image. I then save it as a TIFF, and I change the file name to include the dimensions of the paper that the image has been sized to. For example, if I size this for like 18 by 24, I would put print 18 by 24 in the file name so that it's self-descriptive. So that then if I look at the image file later, I know exactly what it is and what it's for. Now, if you are making a really large print, like through Whitewall or some other place, and you get errors when you're trying to upload your image file because the file is just too big, that's a common thing that can happen. One of the things you can do to help resolve that is come up here to the image menu, go to mode, and change it from 16 bits to 8 bits. Change it to 8 bits, save the TIFF image. There shouldn't be, any real change in the colors or anything in your image. And then the file size will be smaller and you should then have no trouble uploading it. If this video was helpful to you, do me a favor and give it a thumbs up down below. It would help me out. And while you're down there, open up the video description because I've put in there some links to various things that I talked about in this video for you to follow up on and to check out afterwards. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.